Good morning. How is everyone? Welcome to the second Management Fellow Lecture of the year. This is jointly sponsored with the Media Fellows, which I think is a wonderful idea. We should do more of this. How many of you are Media Fellows? Be proud, be loud. Okay. How many of you are Management Fellows? Woo! How many don't? Nah, never mind. None of the above. When I was a kid growing up, 1,000 years ago, when the crust of the earth was still warm, the first thing I did, one of my first memories is we had a morning newspaper. We also had an evening newspaper that was delivered. And so every morning and every evening, and that's the way the news was delivered to us, right? It was known as 24/7 stuff. I don't know how many evening newspapers are left. I'm not sure, but I know Kansas City doesn't have one, and neither does Indianapolis. So there's been a radical changing of the news over the last 300 years while I've been alive. One of the nice things about DePauw, we bring in people who are actually practicing a profession. And so we are privileged. I'll let you read Mark's CV on the program. We are really honored to have someone of his caliber here to share his expertise. And so he's going to talk about the news and what's happening in the news front. So please help me welcome Mark to DePauw and the Management Fellow Lecture Series.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. My goal today is to get you to care about the news. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it from the lens of the newspaper, because I think the newspaper is rather unique in American society, because we have this thing called the Constitution and freedom of the press. And as people's habits of consumption of news have changed away from newspapers, news as a actual commodity has actually changed as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. A little bit about me. First of all, I worked in the news business for a long time, for 30 years. Most of that was in newspapers, working for some really good newspapers with some very talented people everywhere from tiny little papers in tiny little towns that you would never want to visit or go to in Wisconsin, all the way up to the Wall Street Journal and then Forbes magazine. And I had the experience of not just working in print, but seeing print change and video come on the scene. And so having to multitask, where we were not just producing content for the print publication, but also for the web and also for video and streaming video with New York. So that was part of my role in the news business. And then about 4 years ago, I went and started teaching first at Ohio University, where I helped them set up a business program, business writing program for journalists. And then Dave, I met Dave, and I ended up coming here, and now I'm at DePauw, working in the multimedia environment. And I still do a fair amount of TV as a guest commentator on different stations, mostly of a financial nature. So what's kind of happening to the media landscape, and why should you as students at DePauw care about this? I thought I'd kind of lay out a little bit about what's happening in different media, and then we'll go into the newspapers. But in terms of news habits and where people get most of their news, most people would say, oh, well, everybody goes online to get their news. But I think you'd see right away that most news consumption is still TV. People still get most of their news from TV, followed by newspapers, followed by radio, and then web, as you can see, is growing dramatically, but is a very small piece of the thing. So news trends, digital platforms, of course, are playing a much bigger role, but roughly a third, 34% of the public say they went online in the past day to get their news. So it's growing, and it isn't to underestimate the internet as a platform, because it is really the future, and it is having lots of implications for the rest of the news business. What's interesting is news consumption, even though there's many ways to get news, and there's almost a blur between news and entertainment content, actually news consumption is actually up. People are consuming more news than ever before, and there's a dedicated group of people that are just news junkies. They consume news in a newspaper, then they read things online, they read a magazine, they listen to NPR on the way home. So overall, Americans are actually spending more time with the news than they were, say, a decade ago. So the idea that nobody listens to news or pays attention to news anymore is just not true. So there's more time. TV, newspaper, and radio consumption is the same as in 2000. 57 minutes, an hour a day spent consuming news, okay? So new digital platforms are really adding, not really detracting. People are supplementing their news consumption, the people who are news consumers, with the digital environment, okay? Okay. So there's many delivery platforms out there. There's many ways to get content, okay? And everybody seems very enamored with the latest and greatest content platform. And certainly content is playing, or platform is playing a role in terms of what is being delivered over those platforms. And the price of what is being delivered is certainly right. It's free, right? So 70 to 100% of the cost of producing news historically has been covered by advertising. So that's how they're able to deliver it to you for free. Of course, if you're a content producer, reporter, editor, writer, freelancer, that's not good news, right? Because if they can't charge for anything, they're probably not going to pay you a whole lot, right? So salaries, this has put a lot of pressure on salaries. So the news is really an industry in transition, and even though TV is the #1 news source, most of the news that's produced is still produced by newspapers. Now who in here, let's see a show of hands, reads a daily newspaper? Okay? So a handful of you. Who in here comes from a household where your parents still get a daily newspaper? Okay, wow, okay. And do they read it or does it sit outside? Depends whether it's cold out, right? If it's snowing, we'll wait till it stops snowing, right? But often people translate or take the habits of their parents. If their parents got newspapers, the newspapers in the house, they'll start reading, and that's often how people become newspaper consumers. So I found this to be very surprising that newspapers produce most of the news that is then consumed and repurposed, but what's happened is it's repurposed and then put on the web, right? Because most people think, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of people think that the web is where most of the news is being produced, but it's not. The web is taking things from other things. Now, how does this happen? We'll talk a little bit about that, but there was a study that Pew did, and they found that 95% of the stories with fresh information came from old media, came from newspapers, the things you don't read. So actually, how many people in here are reading newspapers? How many people here read the web? So you guys are reading newspapers. You're reading content that came from the news, right? You just don't have ink on your fingers when you're done. Okay. So newspaper facts, it's the second oldest media. Plays a much greater role as facilitators of political expression than other media historically. And until recently, it was the most profitable of all media industries. All media. So they had operating profit margins, which I know this means something to the business fellows here, 20 to 35%. Wow. Okay. Now the average industrial company is what? About 10%, 10, 12%. So it was like more than double, in some cases triple what, say, a GE was, or a Whirlpool or a big industrial company was making. Incredibly profitable, okay? So, and they, as for SAC code, which is standard industrial code, they're categorized as a manufacturer, okay? So they were a manufacturer, yet they made margins like 3 times the manufacturers. So no wonder Wall Street started rubbing its hands when a lot of the newspaper companies in the 60s and 70s said, yes, we want to sell stock and go public. Wall Street started saying, wow, this is going to be, something great. Get in on this. Okay. So top 25 circulating newspapers, Wall Street Journal tops it, followed by USA Today, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, all the big papers you would expect. Newspaper revenues picture, the core of newspaper problems have been basically rapidly declining ad revenues. Not rapidly declining circulation revenues, but rapidly declining ad revenues. And we'll talk about that. Ad revenues have fallen 48% since 2006. The decline has slowed, but advertising revenue is still falling. Why? Well, it's migrating a lot of different places. The web is one place, and we'll talk about that. Ad revenues declined another 6.3% in 2010, and ad revenue is declining not just at newspapers, but also online. So if you say, well, I'm not going to go to the newspaper, or I'm not going to be with a print product, I'm going to be online, well, guess what? Online is not doing very well either at this juncture. It doesn't mean that online won't do well later, but it's not doing very well. Okay. Profit margins, the average publicly traded newspaper company averaged 17% pre-tax. The other figure, right, was operating. Some firms actually produce 25 to 30%, and size matters. Bigger circulation, the large papers tend to be less profitable. The really profitable papers tend to be somewhere in the 35 to a 200,000 circulation. So I don't think the banner graphic is raking in the dough, but I think something maybe about 3 or 4, would guess that's what, Gary, a circulation of 10,000 maybe? 8,000? Okay, so something about 5 times that size, 3 or 4 or 5 times, that would, in a monopoly market, would make good money. You don't want to, if you were going to buy a newspaper, buy the Indianapolis Star. There's too much cost involved, okay? So many papers are still currently profitable, but they've done it through cost cutting, and they've been shrinking news hole and staff. So what's the industry breakdown? Well, in '85 we had 1,500 papers, and about 96% existed as the only newspaper in their market, which allowed them in a pre-web world to essentially set whatever price they wanted to set to charge for advertising. Couldn't set it too high because people stopped advertising, but essentially they were monopoly businesses. There was none competition, and in cities where there was competition, a lot of them had gone together and merged their business operations, which lowered their costs. So it was a monopoly business. It was a very profitable business, and the people who own those businesses would take and spend a lot of money on journalism and news. Okay, they were often first family-owned and then later publicly owned, but they were community-owned, and they put money back into the business. Okay, it's a whole different philosophy from what is operating today. So we fast forward to 2009, and we have 1,600 newspapers in '90. Total fell 14% to 1,300, but we still have 1,300 newspapers. Some papers have decreased their frequency to less than 7 days, and newspaper employment peaked at 54,000 in 2000. Jobs have since declined 26%. Some cases I've seen 30%, but between 26 and 30%, where they've slashed to the workforce. So newspapers really face two central problems, and one is a decline in circulation, and the second is a disappearance of advertising. Okay, so long term, they've had a long-term problem where circulation has not been growing at the same rate of population growth, and that's been that case for 40 or 50 years. Okay. So here's what's kind of happened to circulation revenues. They decline much more slowly than advertising revenues, but you can see a chart here. And Sunday is typically where newspapers make most of their money. That's their most profitable paper because it has the most advertising in it and it has the most circulation. Okay? And here gives you an idea of paid circulation. So in 1940 we had 41 million. In 2009 we had 45 million. But what doesn't this tell you? What doesn't this tell you? What happened between 1940, and 2009. Anybody? What happened to the United States? Did it get any bigger, or it stay the same? Population growth, right? Population growth, we have a population of about 312 million now in the United States. So this kind of looks at a couple different charts, what's happened to circulation, revenue per paid, and circulation per capita. So again, you know, ad pricing is not holding up. They're not taking in the same kind of revenue. And again, circulation longer term, what's happening to our readers, they're going away. So ad share has been dropping even as ad spending, business spends more on ads, okay? Total ad spending during the same time period tripled to 172.8 billion with a B, okay? And this gives you an idea if you track ad revenue versus GDP or gross domestic product of what's been happening. So for a long time, ad spending or ad revenue tracked GDP. But look what's happened to it. It leveled off in about 1990, which is pre-internet, or actually fell in 1990. Had a little bit of a tick up during the 90s, and then has started to drop again, right? Okay. This gives you by different ad spending by different media. So if you think that advertising and what's happening in advertising is just a newspaper problem, you're wrong. It's a problem across the board where ad spending is being spent among a lot of different media, and it is under pressure. There's lots of pressure on the advertising business because of what's happening in the general economy. Okay, so it gives you 1995 versus 2008 for each of these. So newspaper revenue, circulation accounts for 20 to 30% of the, so when you buy a newspaper, about 20%, well, what they collect on that subscription price or on that cover price, that's about 20% of the revenue. The rest is all advertising. Okay? And retail ads provide most the ad content. By retail, I mean the display ads, the ones with the pictures, the big ads. That's where that's the most. There's some of the most they're most costly to produce, but they also produce the greatest amount of revenue. So, but what's happened to classified advertising? Well, classified advertising is really the big problem that newspapers have. It's fallen off a cliff, as you can see. Extremely profitable to produce those 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 line ads, and many newspapers were filled with advertising, right? Help wanted, car, for sale, home sales, okay? So print advertising peaked in 2000. Classified ads then equaled display ads as the largest category. And so we see this dramatic drop-off in help wanted advertising. Why is classified leaving newspapers? Anybody know? Venture to guess? Yes? Has to do with online, right? It's all gone to Craigslist. So very hard to price something and charge for it when someone else offers it for free, right? The guy says, I don't care if I, right? Founder of Craigslist says, I don't care if I make money. He does actually make money, but he doesn't care. He's had offers to sell his company for multiple billions. But in many cases, he's offering a large part of his product mix free, right? So very hard to compete with that. And that's what's happened. There's been this migration online for classified. Plus, you could argue that online is a much more efficient delivery mechanism than having to go get a paper, look it up in the paper, right? Get lost in the paper, try to find it, rather you could just put it in a search engine and find it. So that's really what's killed newspapers. It isn't that people are not reading newspapers anymore. It's that classified has left the newspapers in droves and has depressed newspaper profits. So not too many businesses can survive that kind of a migration, right? If their revenue base, if their revenue and their profit base leaves and still stay in business. So all these ad categories, some of which were very thick, used to pick up the Chicago Tribune, and the car section and the home section were huge, right? I mean, they were enormous profit generators. There was a drop-off because of the recession, but there's also been a drop-off over the last 10, 12 years because it's all migrating to the web. And this gives you an idea of what has happened to each of these categories. auto, real estate, recruitment, and other, and none of these are recovering. And the really sad thing is they're not coming back. So what's happening to news content is what I really want to get to. This is all a setup of the business model of how newspapers operate and what's happened to their business. But what you should be concerned about as students, as citizens, as graduates who are going to go out into the workforce is what's happening actually to the news content. Well, there's been a content explosion. The internet removes all barriers to entry so everyone can publish. Okay, you no longer need a TV station license, a lot of fancy equipment. You no longer need a printing press and a plant. Okay, you have a computer and an internet connection and you can publish things on the internet, right? And you're saying, well, what's the matter with that? It sounds really great to me. Okay, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. So you have low-cost delivery, easy access, and a new platform for advertising. So newspapers have been battling this. They were first to move online in the 90s. It isn't that they said, no, we're not going to do any of this. And they used to post their content after it was published in the newspaper online, okay? And they decided not to charge for this. There was a conscious decision to do that because they figured that the newspapers are profit center, the web is new, it's growing, and at some point we will capture enough revenue off this that will more than cover the cost of running this internet site. So, and they looked at the internet really in the 90s as a bonus or another way to just capture revenue, and that advertising would be additional advertising. It would not be advertising that would leave the paper and all go online. Okay, so as we know, some of that thinking was not correct and things have changed. So they underestimated really their ability to sell advertising, and ad revenue at newspaper sites is not replacing the revenue loss at the print publication. So their biggest profit center is still the newspaper, and where they have the most advertising is still the newspaper. So what's happened at in the web environment is that there's many websites and there's many alternatives for people to advertise. Okay? So online ads are in some cases replacing print, but they're not replacing the print revenue. They're not, and so what's happening is the newspapers are losing that revenue, or that revenue is evaporating. It's going elsewhere. Okay? And advertisers really now are in the driver's seat. They can spend wherever they want, and there's more venues for them to spend. So what's that doing to advertising? Well, it's pushing down prices, right? So content is getting cheaper, advertising is getting cheaper. So for those of you who are going to go into the advertising business, right, you're not going to make the kind of money that you would have made 5 or 10 years ago because there isn't the kind of, they can't charge the kind of pricing they can. It's like all businesses, the internet has equalized or pushed down pricing. And you may say, yeah, well, that's really good because I like my news for free. Yes, but if you're doing anything related to the internet or a business that's affected by the internet, it's going to influence how much revenue and how much profit you derive, okay, unless you have a large-scale business. So web ad revenue is falling. Wait a minute. Isn't the web where everything's supposed to be? No. Web ad revenue has been falling too, exactly for what I was talking about, because of pricing and because of there's so many outlets and so much competition there. So what's this done to the newspapers? Well, it's crippled them. There's 13 newspapers have filed for bankruptcy, including the Chicago Tribune. More than 100 newspapers have gone out of business. So we're seeing a change in the channel, the distribution channel. And 30% of the journalists that are working at these newspapers are gone, okay? They're gone.